Okay, in this chapter we're going to basically focus on creating the specular and reflective maps for our actual exterior hull and overall every texture for the most part of this chopper model. Right now we're inside Photoshop and I'm simply going through every single layer and organizing them to basically be more effective and efficient in the actual process of generating the specular and reflective maps. So what you're seeing me do is group them according to the various categories and making sure these categories coincide with the types of effects I'm going to be doing later on. So once I have this basically arranged in a decent way, we're going to begin creating layer comps for our document. In this case, a layer comp for the color map. Now all layer comps simply do are organize your layers in actual layouts that you can use and change between depending on what it is you're trying to create. In our case, since we want to make, an actual specular map or reflective map based off of this color map, it's good to have the different, states that the layers exist in to be arranged in these compositions so that when we switch between them, we can actually compare and contrast the different things that we've done to the document. So right now I'm going to make a layer adjustment to basically desaturate all the color that's presently in the document right now. So basically once I make this layer adjustment, it turns into a simple grayscale image, as you can see here. This will be the base or foundation for both our specular and reflective maps. So what I'm going to do right now is simply go through and basically inspect all the various decals because these particular objects are going to be more reflective and or specular in their appearance than the rest of the chopper itself, minus any kind of blooming metal or such. So in this case, as we go to the decals, I'm going to simply organize the layer so that we have them set up or arranged in a way that when I create the next step to this particular part, it actually makes sense. So right now I flattened out a copy of my decals all into one layer, and I'm basically going to make a layer adjustment to invert them from being black to a white or highly bright gray color. And by making a layer mask to only focus in on the text itself and not the entire document, we can see our decals basically have turned white with a layer adjustment and actually not have been affected by anything else but that. So as you can see, we're about to create our specular composition here. And as we are beginning to do that, I'm just looking through the layers really quick to make sure everything's in place and cleaning up any miscellaneous things I don't need. I'm also toning down the intensity of our decals and signage here so that they're not as bright as they were before. And I'm looking overall to check the contrast of the document. And so far it appears to be okay. I'm just going through and making sure, again, the layers are set up the way I want them to be. And now I'm making a new curve adjustment. And we're basically going to go in there and tweak basically the actual worn edges and major scratches on those leading edges of our various doors and exterior hardware. As you can see, they basically are white to indicate the underlying metal beneath shining through. So here I'm just inspecting it to make sure again that these levels and contrast are what I want them to be. And they appear to be working pretty good so far, but I'm still going to add some more layer adjustments here. This time I'm going to do a simple brightness and contrast and simply pump those values up so that it becomes a little bit crunchier in its range, so that when we have this applied to an actual material and light catches certain angles or reaches certain glancing angles, it has something to bite onto and actually be affected by. So using this node to play with the contrast, we can basically push and pull those values as we see fit overall in the image. So don't be afraid to try different values to get the look that you want. So here we go with our variations there. And next I'm basically going to try to tweak the bolts themselves, but I think I'll just go on to something else for now. Let's see what we can do with some of this door hinges and stuff. I'll go through there, just looking around, looking for my base layer there, and scrolling through. Okay, I basically think I'll probably just load that guy up and basically use him as a selection mask of sorts to control this next layer adjustment. So what I did is I duplicated the actual vector shapes and flattened them so that I can actually select them as a mask, and I'm now applying some layer adjustments to just those regions that were selected. And as you can see, the grunge in those areas as well as the underlying paint are basically being manipulated to much more intense and contrasty values. This way, when it's on the material, we will know exactly what areas will be getting hit by light and reflective, and which parts will be pretty much dull and not so, reflective in their intensities. And I'm not sure if you noticed, but I did utilize the info tool to just check the colors I'm doing right now to see if I have any true black values. I try to avoid those as much as possible because if this were an EXR file similar to the types that we use in the production environment, that would basically clamp out the values to a range that I really wouldn't want it to go to, and that negatively affects the render. So by having values that hover just above black, and in some cases just a little bit below white, we're able to keep it in the range that should it ever be converted to an EXR or high dynamic range image, we can actually pump in values beyond those particular steps. So here we are, and I'm just basically clicking through and turning on and off the various layer adjustments to see if my spec component is matching up to what was already determined in my material before me concerning, what values work for being shiny, what works for being not shiny, and what works for just being, basically there and average. So right now I'm going through and just looking at the hardware that we have attached to the exterior hull of our ship, and I'm basically going to pump up the values on that because this particular metal bit should be a little bit brighter than the surrounding environment and or paint in this case. And pretty much just looking around to see if there's other things that I may have forgotten or overlooked. For the most part it looks to be fine. All the decals seem to be in their reflective state and are working out pretty well. And also a lot of the grunge seems to be behaving itself as well. So I'm going to basically call this particular layer comp our spec since it has gotten to that point. And as you can see, I'm simply just flipping between the color and the spec, and you can see how it was changed and altered to be what it is right now. And as you look at these values, basically you'll realize over time that one particular set of textures builds upon another. So right now I'm adding a layer adjustment to tweak the overall effect of this newly created, layer comp. And right now I'm just tweaking the contrast and distribution of the various noise and artifacts that basically break up that surface specifically for lighting purposes. So as we set this up right now to become our next layer comp, which follows the specular one, I'm just going to go through the image itself and make sure things are falling into place where they're supposed to be. I like how some of these values are looking, and as you probably can tell, this will become our reflection map. So for the most part, It just is a matter of setting up the values to be within the range that we need them to be. So I'm going to basically make right now, well, I'm going to save the file first before I do anything else. That way I don't lose any kind of important information. So and here we go, saving out our file so that we don't lose anything. A good habit to have. Again, can't emphasize that enough. You don't want to know how many documents I've lost over the years. But now that we have our document saved, I'm just going to flatten this out here, and let's see if we can save a copy to our source images directory for viewing later. And another copy so I can back up in my own personal source images directory. And basically, I'm going to resize this image to be a little smaller for viewing purposes later also. So I'm basically making two versions of those files for that reason. But this is not a step necessary in most production environments because you're typically working on the latest hardware. But in my case, I have a much slower machine, so I have to work within the confines of it. So right now we're looking at the color map being processed and being saved out to eventually be loaded up together with the specular map and the reflective map. So speaking of which, let's see if we can jump in there and begin to create it. So now that we have our spec and color set up, we can now focus on our reflection map itself. So I'm going to go back through and test out the layers to see what layers can actually contribute to the reflective map and which layers basically can go hidden and not do any kind of direct, editing or changing of the look itself. So I like how some of these are right now, so I'm not going to touch what's not broken. And more than likely might hide some of that as we begin to create the final reflection map for this particular part of the chopper. So just going through, inspecting and checking out what's there. I like a lot of the grunge detail that's showing through. Probably want to emphasize that a little bit more, but also want to make this surface a little bit more uniform and a little less noisy so that it becomes more of a underlying pattern of where reflection should be as opposed to where specular breakup should be. So I'm right now creating a layer adjustment to tweak some of those values overall. And basically I'm going to try to crunch some of these to a little more extreme regions just to overemphasize what's not reflective and what is reflective. And depending on the material that you're using, that usually will determine how intense or how high certain things should go in order for it to create the effect that you want. And since we're using a custom shading network to make some of these materials, basically I have an idea roughly of what range is okay for me to work in and where I should basically taper off and not go as high. And usually in a production environment, you have look dev artists that basically research all those individual values and in some cases establish them so that when you begin painting your maps out, you know exactly which range you are allowed to be in order to create the look that you have to do for that particular task. So as you can see here, I'm basically creating a more general, almost uniform tonality across the painted surface here, and the only main areas of contrast occur simply where those parts that are not reflective exist. They're simply towards closer to the blacker range of the spectrum, and that they can basically, occlude any kind of light coming towards them. You can just see me here manipulating one of the curves for one of the layer adjustments to get my values right. And know that I don't want this to be that shiny because it still is a painted surface, but not a new one. Okay, here we are just going over the reflective map that we're creating. And it's pretty much been pushed to about the range I want to see overall. We have some nice contrast over the entire surface here, specifically where regions have been worn down and paint has been taken off. And they're going to be, overall not as reflective as other parts, except for where that underlying metal bleeds through. That's going to be really intense and somewhat shinier than that paint because it is a metallic surface after all. So I'm just going through, checking the details, making sure some parts are not overlooked, and in general the whole document itself should be somewhat uniform in its noise distribution in this particular channel. Since we're utilizing what we created before to create this particular map, a lot of the masking and areas of intense, either interest or I guess complications, you want to pay attention to them a lot more than normal. But for the most part, as long as your ranges are within acceptable values, you should be okay. So right now I'm creating the new layer comp, basically for our reflection map, and it shall go underneath the color and spec in our layer comp, window here. So as I flip between the three, you can see the changes of what's really going on across the board between these various maps and how they basically will ultimately work together to create that final look that we want for our chopper here. So here we go. So I'm clicking through here. Overall, everything looks to be of decent quality. I'm just checking now some of the values in the blacks here, make sure they're not clamped out to 0. And as I go through here, inspecting around, and gonna basically begin the process of just saving out this particular document to our regular everyday savings. And once it's saved, I'm just going to exit out here and cut to basically the setup of some of the other metal and metallic surfaces, and pretty much going to drag and drop a lot of the same layer adjustments that we had in the previous document into this one, and basically create our spec and our reflection channel from a previously existing scene file. So as we go through this, as you can see, I'm going to basically convert it to a grayscale by simply dragging one grayscale from another document to the other, which is pretty straightforward, just to get the color to be out of there. Now that that's set up for the most part, we're going to start applying a lot more of those specular layer adjustments so that we can see more contrast and more visual interest across the range of models that we have going so far into this particular production. So okay, basically here I'm just dragging and dropping from one Photoshop document to another the actual layer adjustments that we created, so that we have a consistency of looks across the range of textures that we're making for the various objects in this particular section. As you can see, we basically have our original whole texture with its corresponding layer comps visible, and then we have now also the clean metal basically visible as well. And we're just creating these individual sections so that when we make the layer comps for them, they actually look the same as the actual objects in the other textures. So right now I'm just tweaking some of the values here. I have a selection mask of some of the components I want to basically change their value intensity of, so that they're a little bit, more contrasted than their neighbors. So now that we have that done, I basically think it's about time to create a new layer comp here of our spec. I'm just going to do some layer editing here, just making sure things look right, and any kind of renaming I have to do, just make sure to go through that. And right here I noticed that the metal here shouldn't be this dark. So basically going in, I'm going to tweak that a little bit. And as you can see, I'm making a new layer adjustment here. And I'm just going to tweak those values so that we have a nice range of contrast for these objects here. So again, there's no one way of accomplishing this, but I prefer using these layer adjustments so that I can manipulate the underlying information without actually changing it in the process. And I'm just checking my values to make sure I don't have any kind of extremely hot or dark areas that can basically cause really, artificial looking artifacts in the render. Going through and renaming some of my layers here. Once again, just making sure everything is lining up the way it's supposed to. And checking objects here. I think I'm going to make a new layer adjustment. Probably mask out these other little bits that I want to emphasize. Again, tweaking the curve. Make sure it's doing what it's supposed to here. And just glancing around my image, checking the values again to make sure they're in line with each other, making sure we don't have one area of specularity more intense than another if these are supposed to be uniform materials. Of course, you have parts that are going to be darker and or brighter based on how worn they are or what has been affecting them. But for the most part, since these are sharing the same map and are supposed to be the same type of metal or metallic surface, then it's good to make sure that their range and values are within, an arm's throw of each other. So I'm just going back in, just tweaking the values a little bit more to get a little bit more punch to the contrast that we have already, so that when this is mapped on to any material, it'll show up the way it's supposed to. It's this gritty metallic surface that's been worn based on usage and lifespan and all those wonderful things. So I zoom in here, you can see a lot more of those little high frequency details coming through, mostly in the form of just grit and noise, but overall it's just to give a grungy, more decrepit type of development over the course or life of that particular object. So again, these textures should be telling stories themselves. This is a chopper that's supposed to exist in a universe of some kind that actually has laws and physics that govern it, and I'm basically just trying to recreate those very same kind of approaches in my work so that when you look at it, it actually makes sense or actually has some type of info to convey. And in this case, it's basically mostly a lot of the engine components and various accessories to guns and other mechanisms on the chopper. So they go through quite a bit more in some cases than other parts as well. And I'm just inspecting the document here, making sure once again everything is the way it's supposed to look. If you haven't noticed, this particular just layer, not even a layer adjustment per se, but just this layer style I'm adding to it is basically brightening the overall look of the metal, and this will then become what we will use for our specular layer comp. So we have a color comp and now have a spec comp, and all we're missing is our reflection comp for this particular group of surfaces. So as we begin to go through these layers again, just to make sure things are again lining up the way they're supposed to, we're going to prepare to make our reflection map. So what I like to go to do is it's just again repeatedly going through these layers to just see how they work together, what ways I can make it more efficient or more productive for the actual look that we're trying to achieve. So I'll flick these on and off depending on any kind of discrepancy I may see or point of interest I may like, just to make sure that I'm recreating what I want to recreate in these effects. So I'll go through this multiple times just to ensure that when someone else comes along and looks at these maps or plugs them in, they actually have consistency. So I just made another layer adjustment here and tweaking the values to their extremes. Since it's going to become a reflection map, we don't really need to be as subtle as we do with a spec map, only because we're trying to forcibly tell a material and or renderer exactly where there should be light interaction and exactly where there shouldn't be any. So it's just a matter of balancing those things out. And in this case it's for reflection, so next to the spec map, those two tend to work together to create the overall material appearance you're trying to get. So just look around here, and everything appears to be spot on. So okay, this basically concludes the behind the scenes DVD for the hard surface texturing. As you can see, we have here an actual final render of all the textures that exist for the chopper model. For the most part, this is not a final render in the sense of the actual composed piece. That will be done later on by our lighter and eventually the compositor. But for now, all I'm basically showing is the textures applied to basic Maya materials, and highlighting the major features and surface detail that we have and the maps that we painted along the way in this DVD. So for the most part, you can just basically see how the painted surfaces, the metallic surfaces all pretty much come together in their basic forms. And once this is passed on and enhanced, you'll get a lot more realism and detail that basically is not showing up in my basic shader work here. Again, another example would be the glass that we have here not being the final glass, because usually that's treated as a post-process where a lot of the reflections and vanilla effects are added or cheated in by the compositors at the end of a particular shot or show. So again, my glass is just a placeholder for the most part, and will be treated much better later on. But aside from that, this is our chopper with the textures applied to it. I hope you like what you see. It was a fun product to work on, and I look forward to what's going to come up with the work with the lighters and compositors to come. So take care, enjoy, and good luck texturing. Bye for now.